I'm here at St. Stephen's Catholic Church in Portland, Oregon, and today is the fourth week of St. Michael's Lent. Let us continue with the second consideration on the Holy Stigmata of St. Francis of Assisi. This is from the book, The Little Flowers of St. Francis. Last week, we had the angel speaking to St. Francis about what was to come after he was gone. And this week we have the Feast of the Assumption arriving. After this, as the Feast of the Assumption of Our Lady was approaching, St. Francis sought opportunity to lodge more solitarily and secretly, so that he might the more privately keep the 40 days fast of St. Michael, which begins with the Feast of the Assumption. And he called Brother Leo to him and spoke thus: "Go and stand in the doorway of the oratory where the brothers are lodged, and when I call thee, return to me." Brother Leo went therefore and stood at the door, and St. Francis waited a little and called aloud. Then Brother Leo, hearing him call, returned to him, and St. Francis said to him, "My son, let us seek another more retired spot, where thou canst not hear me when I call." And seeking further, they found at some distance, on the southern side of the mountain, a solitary spot exactly suited to his desire. But it was impossible to get to it, because there lay an immense rock with a yawning and fearful chasm in front of it. But with great pains they laid a piece of wood across it, so as to form a bridge, and got over. Then St. Francis sent for the other brothers and told them how it was his intention to pass the 40 days fast of St. Michael in this solitary spot, and he prayed them to make him a little cell there, where no cry of his could be heard by them. And when the cell was made, he said to them, "Go ye to your place, and leave me alone, for I purpose, with the help of God, to keep the fast undisturbed, and without distraction of mind. And therefore, let not any of you come to me, nor suffer any one to come. But thou only, Brother Leo, and once only in the day, come to me with a little bread and water, and once again in the night at the hour of Matins, and then come silently. And when thou art at the end of the bridge, thou shalt say, Domine, labia mea aperies, which means, Lord, open thou my lips, which is the beginning of Matins. If I answer thee, pass over and come to the cell. But if I answer thee not, then depart quickly." And St. Francis said thus, because several times he had been so ravished in God that he had neither heard anything nor felt any bodily sensation. And having thus spoken, he gave them his blessing, and they returned to their place. And the Feast of the Assumption being now come, St. Francis began to keep the fast with very great abstinence and austerity, macerating his body and comforting his spirit with fervent prayer, vigil, and discipline. And in these his prayers he grew continually from grace to grace, disposing his soul to receive the divine mysteries and the divine splendors, and his body to sustain the cruel assaults of the demons, with whom many a time he had bodily conflicts. And among others, it happened once, during this fast, that St. Francis, coming one day out of his cell, and betaking himself fervently to prayer in the hollow of a cleft rock, from whence a fearful precipice descended from an immense height to the ground. The devil suddenly appeared to him under a terrible form and a very great tempest and tumult, and struck him in order to thrust him down the precipice. Then St. Francis, having nowhere to fly, and not able to endure the hideous aspect of the demon, turned quickly back, and sought with hands and feet and with all his body to cling to the rock, recommending himself to God and feeling about with his hands for something to hold on to. But as it pleased God, who never suffers his servants to be tempted above what they are able to bear, the rock to which he was clinging immediately hollowed itself into the shape of his body, and received him into itself, so that he sank into it as though it had been melted wax, imprinting the form of his hands and face on the rock, and thus by the help of God he escaped from the devil. But that which the evil spirit could not do at that time to St. Francis, he did a good while after his death to one of his dear and holy brothers, who was carrying some pieces of wood to the same place, in order to make it possible to visit it without peril, out of devotion to St. Francis, and the miracle which had there taken place. One day the devil pushed him with violence, when he had a large log on his head, which he was going to lay across the chasm, and caused him to fall down, with the log still upon his head. But God, who had concealed and preserved St. Francis from falling, by his merits concealed and preserved the brother also from the peril of his fall. For as he fell, he commended himself with a loud voice and with great devotion to St. Francis, who immediately appeared to him, and took him and placed him gently down at the foot of the rocks, without his having sustained the least shake or bruise. Now the brothers, who had heard him cry out as he fell, believed that he must be dead, considering the great height from which he had fallen, and the sharpness of the rocks beneath him. And they took a bier, and with great sorrow and weeping came from the other side of the mountain, with intent to gather up the fragments of his body, and to bury them. And when they had descended the mountain, the brother who had fallen came to meet them, with the same log on his head with which he had fallen, and singing Te Deum Laudamus with a loud voice. Now we'll pause there. The Te Deum Laudamus, for those of you who've been on our rosary walks here, we pray the Te Deum Laudamus when we return as a song of thanksgiving. It's a good way of completion, but it's also a way of giving thanks to God when something good has happened. So historically, when an heir to the throne is born, a Te Deum would be sung. When a new pope has been elected, a Te Deum would be sung. When a war has ended, the Te Deum is sung. So we see here that as he was saved from a terrible accident, from his death, he sang a Te Deum Laudamus. A Te Deum is sung at the end of Matins on feast days as a completion. Now, as an aside, by tradition, the Te Deum was composed by St. Ambrose and St. Augustine on the night before St. Augustine's baptism. Scholars will say it was written by somebody else around the same time. But why ruin a good story? I prefer to believe that it is, as the legend says, written by St. Augustine and St. Ambrose on the night before his baptism. Well, let's continue. So the brother who had fallen came to meet them with the same log on his head with which he had fallen, and singing Te Deum Laudamus with a loud voice. And as they greatly marveled, he related to them in order all the manner of his fall, and how St. Francis had rescued him from all peril. Then all the brothers went with him to the spot, devoutly singing Te Deum Laudamus, and praising and thanking God and St. Francis for the miracle which had been performed for their brother. Now we're just going to go ahead and keep pushing through, because we're almost done with this second consideration of the stigmata. Now, in the aforesaid 40 days fast, St. Francis, as had been already told, although he sustained many attacks from the demons, he had nevertheless received much consolation from God, not only through angelic visitations, but through the birds of the wood. For during all the time of the fast, a falcon, which had built its nest close to the cell, woke him every night, a little before matins, with its note, and with the beating of its wings against the cell, and departed not until he arose to say matins. And when he happened to be more weary than usual, or weak, or infirm, the falcon, like a discreet and compassionate person, woke him later than usual. And for this cause St. Francis took great delight in this bird, because by its solicitude for him, it drove from him all idleness, constantly inviting him to prayer, and besides this, oftentimes by day it would sit familiarly with him. St. Francis, being greatly weakened in body through his great abstinence and the assaults of the demons, and desiring to sustain his body by the spiritual nourishment of the soul, began to think upon the immeasurable glory and joy of the blessed in the life eternal, and to pray that God would grant him the favor of tasting a little of this joy. And as he thought thus within himself, suddenly there appeared to him an angel in great splendor, who had a viol in his left hand, and in his right hand a bow. And whilst St. Francis stood stupefied at the vision, the angel drew the bow once across the viol, and immediately there was heard such sweet melody that his soul was inebriated with sweetness, and he lost all bodily sense, insomuch that, as he afterward related to his companions, he thought that if the angel had drawn the bow a second time across the strings, his soul through excessive sweetness would have parted from his body. And there we complete the second consideration on the Holy Stigmata, and we'll continue with the third consideration on the Holy Stigmata with our next video. Yes, there are more good things to come. Well, there we are. So, what do we learn from this? Well, again, we learn that, as we did last week, temptations are good. Temptations mean that we are God's friend. And in the case of fasting, abstinence, and temptations, there is a sweetness. There are other consolations to be discovered. Now, St. Francis might never have been consoled or found this friend in the bird, in the falcon, if he were satiated with food. And now think about that. When you're satiated with food, your spirit is not as receptive. You're more sluggish. Now you might, which doesn't mean that, like when you're fasting, you can lack strength, but you still have a certain energy. So we want to think about the consolations and the sweetness that we need to discover in these times of penance and fasting. Maybe you've been having trouble with penance and fasting these last 3 weeks. Well, this fourth week is another opportunity to make a new resolution and get back on track. I mean, that's what these seasons of penance and fasting are all about. Acknowledging your weakness, acknowledging where you don't have what it takes. And let's face it, we don't have what it takes. But God has what it takes. And God can provide when you weaken yourself. If you're too strong, well, you're saying that you don't need God's help. When you weaken yourself, then you allow God to work through your weakness. So even if you're a failure at fasting, you're a failure at your penances, give thanks to God for your failure. It's very humbling. It's good to be humbled. But persevere, because if you're not used to fasting, or if you haven't been fasting since Lent, well, it can take a few weeks to really kind of get into the rhythm of it. And just trust it. A few good days of fasting, and you start to understand and be receptive to certain graces, certain little gifts that God wishes to give you. And so in the case of St. Francis, he has this raven that wakes him up on time for Matins, except when he needs more sleep. And the raven allows him a little time extra, comes a little bit later. Isn't that interesting? But see, in that sense, God is granting him the time through the means of this instrument that God uses in the falcon. So we need to receive what God has to give us and not grasp after it ourselves. And that's the point of fasting and abstinence. We're not grasping after that which will make us strong. Rather, we are weakening ourselves and allowing God to give us what will make us strong. So that's our assignment for this week. Think about what God has to give us and then be looking out for it. How is God wishing to make us strong this week through our weakness, through our fasting, through our penances? All right, well, let's head inside and we'll pray the chaplet of St. Michael the Archangel. And to do so, you can click on the link in the description below this video for the prayer of the chaplet. Persevere. It's worth it. It's 40 days of St. Michael's Lent. It's very good. It's a great gift. Give thanks to God for it. And I'll see you next week. And don't miss a day of prayer with us.